She always turned away when I reached for closeness, so I stopped reaching. Now, when she calls my name, I let the silence answer her instead. I didn't notice it the first time. Maybe I told myself it was nothing, just a bad day, or maybe she was tired. But the truth is, when someone you love starts pulling away, it rarely happens all at once. It happens in small, quiet ways. And if you're not careful, you convince yourself those little moments don't mean anything, until they pile up into something you can't ignore. I remember reaching for her hand once. We were walking back from the grocery store, the air cool, the kind of evening where the streetlights cast a soft orange glow on the pavement. I slipped my fingers over hers, the way I always did, waiting for that small squeeze back that told me she was right there with me. Instead, she gently pulled away, tucking her hand into her jacket pocket like it was the most natural thing in the world. She smiled faintly, said something about the weather, and kept walking. I laughed it off, told myself she must have been cold. But the truth? The space between our palms stayed with me the whole night. It was the same when I leaned in to kiss her cheek while she sat at the kitchen counter, sipping her wine after work. She tilted her head slightly away, letting my lips brush just the corner of her jaw before she murmured, "Not now, I'm tired." Tired. That word became the quiet wall between us. Her presence was still everywhere, her perfume lingering on the couch cushions, her voice drifting through the hallway as she hummed while folding laundry, the sound of her heels clicking across the floor. She was there, and yet, she wasn't really there with me. I began to notice how carefully she avoided moments that used to be so natural. How she shifted her body when I sat too close. How her laughter no longer rose easily when I teased her. And still, I tried. I told myself closeness was something you kept alive with effort. So I'd step behind her while she cooked, slipping my arms around her waist. For a heartbeat, I'd feel the warmth of her back against my chest, her scent of jasmine and something faintly citrus filling my lungs. But then, she would stiffen, almost flinch, and whisper, "Please, not now." Do you know what it feels like to stand there with all your affection in your hands, and have the person you love turn it away? It's like carrying a gift you wrapped carefully, with ribbons and care, only to watch it left unopened on the table. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. That she loved me, and maybe she just needed space. But late at night, lying in bed with the moonlight stretching across the sheets, I began to feel it, that creeping loneliness of lying beside someone who feels miles away. Her breathing was steady, peaceful even, but when I reached for her hand under the covers, she slipped it back to her side. And I stared up at the ceiling, wondering when the warmth between us had started to fade, and why I was the only one fighting to hold it together. Silence has a way of filling a room louder than words ever could. At first, I thought it was just the long days wearing her down, that maybe I was expecting too much of her. But over time, the silence between us began to carry its own weight. It pressed on my chest when we sat together. It whispered in the pauses between our conversations. I'd tell her about something funny that happened at work, a story I thought would make her laugh the way she used to, head tilted back, eyes shining, her hand brushing mine in those careless, tender ways. But instead, her eyes would wander to her phone, her thumb scrolling as if my words were background noise. I'd watch the corner of her lips twitch faintly, like she was trying to smile for my sake, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. And in that moment, my story didn't matter. I didn't matter. On the couch, where we once leaned into each other like gravity itself was pulling us close, there was now an empty stretch of cushions. I sat at one end, she sat at the other, her legs curled under her, her gaze fixed on the television. The flickering light washed over her face, softening her features, but all I could think about was how far away she felt, even when she was just a few feet from me. I used to inch closer, closing the gap, hoping she'd shift toward me. But after enough times of feeling her stiffen, I stopped moving. I let the distance stay. At night, when I reached out beneath the sheets, I found nothing but cool fabric. She would turn onto her side, her back facing me, her breathing deep and even. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the city outside the window, wondering if she even noticed how long it had been since we'd really touched. And something inside me began to change. I stopped trying as hard. I stopped chasing those little moments, stopped asking for them, because each rejection left a bruise I couldn't explain. Instead, I grew quiet. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table with her laptop open, papers spread out. She looked up briefly, offered me a tired smile, and said, "Could you grab me some tea?" Normally, I would have been quick to nod, to fuss over the details, to make sure it was exactly how she liked it. But that night I hesitated. I looked at her, the woman I loved, and for the first time I felt the urge not to give. To keep my hands still, my words short. "I'll get it in a bit," I murmured, and I walked past her. The silence that followed was thick, stretching between us like an invisible wall. That was when I realized silence wasn't just something happening to us anymore. It was something I was starting to choose. It happened so slowly that I almost didn't recognize myself in the process. For so long, I had been the one who leaned in first, the one who reached out, who gave, who filled the silences with little acts of care. But after enough times of being turned away, something in me shifted. I didn't announce it, I didn't decide it outright. I just stopped. The first time she noticed was subtle. She was curled up in her chair by the window, a soft blanket draped over her legs, and without looking up from her book, she said, "Could you bring me some water?" I heard the way her voice carried expectation, the kind of tone that assumed I'd move without hesitation. And once I would have. But that night, I let the request hang in the air. I answered with a quiet, "In a minute," but I never got up. I sat on the couch, staring at the muted television screen, feeling the weight of my own stillness. When she finally glanced up, her eyes lingered on me a moment longer than usual, puzzled, almost hurt. She didn't repeat herself. She simply went to the kitchen, poured her own glass, and returned without a word. After that, it became a pattern. She'd ask me to fix the lamp in the bedroom, and I'd shrug, saying, "Later." She'd ask if I could grab the mail on my way in, and I'd pretend I forgot. These were small things, ordinary things I'd once done gladly just to see her relax, but withholding them gave me a strange sense of control. For once, it was her turn to feel the distance. And I could see it unsettled her. She lingered more when she spoke to me, as if testing the air between us. She watched me a little longer when I didn't rush to her side. Even her tone softened, less commanding, more tentative. It was like she wasn't sure who I was becoming, and to be honest, either was I. But the truth was, every ignored request carried a quiet echo of the times she'd ignored me. Every time I let her fend for herself, it was my way of saying, "Do you feel it now? Do you understand what it's like to reach for someone and find nothing waiting for you?" One evening stands out in my memory. She was cooking dinner, the sound of onions sizzling in the pan filling the kitchen, and she called out, "Could you grab the salt?" Her voice was warm, casual, as if everything was the same as it had always been. But I stayed seated at the table, my arms crossed, watching the steam rise from the pan. When she turned, her eyes met mine, questioning, almost pleading, but I just nodded toward the counter where the salt sat within her reach. She hesitated, then picked it up herself. The clink of the glass jar against the stove was louder than it should have been, sharp in the quiet room. That sound stayed with me. It was the sound of something fragile beginning to crack. She had always carried herself with a kind of quiet grace. Confident, self-assured, the kind of woman who never seemed to second-guess her place in a room. That confidence was one of the first things that drew me to her. It made me feel safe, grounded, even when I was younger, uncertain, still figuring out who I was. But lately, I began to notice something different in her. Something I had never seen before. It was in the way she lingered in doorways longer than necessary, watching me with a softness that looked almost hesitant. Or how her hand would rest briefly on my arm when she passed by, light, fleeting touches, as though she were testing the waters, waiting to see if I'd pull away. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found her standing by the sink, her back turned to me. She wasn't moving, not really. Just standing there, fingers curled tightly around a mug as if she needed its warmth to steady her. Steam drifted up between us, blurring the edges of her face when she finally looked up. Her shoulders, usually so straight, so proud, seemed smaller somehow, drawn in, almost fragile. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't look away. There was something unspoken in them, a question she couldn't quite voice. And in that silence I realized, she was the one searching now. She was the one unsure. Another night I caught it again. She was in the living room, adjusting the books on the shelf, her movements slower than usual. I sat on the couch, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I could feel her glance toward me, once, twice, 3 times. Finally she spoke, her voice lower, gentler than before. "Do you want to watch something together?" It wasn't just a question about a movie. It was an invitation. A reaching out. And I knew it. But I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, long enough that she shifted her weight, biting lightly at her lip, her fingers tapping nervously against the spine of a book. She looked uncertain. And that, more than anything, unsettled me. This was the woman who once seemed untouchable, who carried her age and her poise like armor. And now, here she was, cracking just enough to let me see the vulnerability beneath. Even her touch had changed. Before, when she brushed against me, it was casual, effortless, the kind of closeness that came from comfort. Now it felt deliberate, searching. When her fingers grazed mine as she passed me the remote one night, I could feel the tremor in them, the hesitation. It wasn't just a touch, it was a question. And I realized something I hadn't before. For all her strength, all her independence, she wasn't immune to the distance I had built between us. She felt it too. And maybe, just maybe, she was afraid of losing me. It happened on a night when the air in the apartment felt heavier than usual. The kind of heaviness that comes from words left unsaid, piling up until they press down on both of you. I was sitting at the table, scrolling absently through my phone, not really seeing anything, when she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost careful. "You've been different lately." I didn't look up right away. I wanted to make her wait, the way I had waited so many nights for her to notice me, to choose me. When I finally lifted my eyes, she was standing across the room, arms folded across her chest, but not in the confident way she usually carried herself. It looked more like a shield. "Different how?" I asked, though I already knew. She hesitated, chewing at the inside of her cheek. "You don't talk to me like you used to. You don't do the things you used to do for me." Her words were softer than her expression, which tried to stay firm. But I could hear the faint edge of something else underneath: hurt, confusion, maybe even regret. I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, my hands pressing flat against the wooden table. "Maybe I stopped because I got tired of being invisible." The silence that followed cut through the room sharper than any argument. Her brows drew together, and she shook her head slightly, as if she didn't understand. "Invisible?" I swallowed, my throat tight. "Do you know what it feels like to reach for someone, again and again, and have them pull away every single time? To offer pieces of yourself, only to have them brushed aside like they didn't matter?" Her lips parted as if she wanted to answer, but no words came. She just stood there, caught between pride and the sting of what I'd said. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't look untouchable. She looked human. Breakable. I continued, my voice low. "I stopped reaching for you because you never let me in." That landed. I saw it in the way her shoulders sagged, in the way her gaze dropped to the floor. She placed her hand lightly on the back of a chair, steadying herself, and for a moment she looked older, not in a way that diminished her, but in a way that revealed the weight she carried. Then, almost hesitantly, she stepped closer. Her hand brushed against the sleeve of my shirt, a barely there touch, trembling as though she wasn't sure if she had the right anymore. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for once, they weren't guarded. They were wide open, raw with everything she hadn't said. It wasn't an apology, not in words. But it was the closest she had come to reaching back. And that, in itself, was enough to make the walls between us begin to crack, after that night, something subtle shifted between us. The silence didn't vanish, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It felt tentative, like both of us were learning how to exist beside each other again without breaking what was left. The next evening, we sat together on the couch. The television flickered with some movie either of us was paying attention to. For weeks we had sat with a gulf of cushions between us, but this time, she closed some of the distance. Not all of it, just enough that her knee brushed against mine when she shifted. It was such a small thing, but my body registered it instantly, like a spark flickering back to life in the ashes. I didn't move. I didn't make it easy for her. But I also didn't pull away. And when her hand eventually slipped onto the cushion between us, inching close enough that her fingers grazed mine, I let them rest there. The touch was feather-light, almost uncertain, but it lingered. For the first time in months, she didn't recoil. Her fingers trembled, just barely, and I wondered if she was afraid I would reject her the way she had rejected me. The thought made my chest tighten. So I turned my hand slightly, enough to let my thumb brush over her knuckles, slow, careful, without pressure. Her breath caught, so faint I might have imagined it, and she let her hand stay. Later that night, we ended up in the kitchen together. She was rinsing dishes, sleeves rolled up, strands of hair falling loose around her face. I dried a plate beside her, and when her elbow bumped mine, she didn't shift away. Instead, she glanced sideways, the corners of her mouth lifting into the smallest of smiles, tired, yes, but real. It wasn't grand gestures that pulled us closer again. It was these tiny allowances. The way she leaned her shoulder lightly into mine as she passed by. The way she lingered when handing me something, her fingers brushing against my palm for just a second longer than necessary. And in those moments, I felt the heaviness between us begin to ease. She was giving something back, not everything, not all at once, but enough to remind me that there was still a thread connecting us. One night, as we sat in bed with the lamp casting a warm glow across the sheets, she shifted closer. Slowly, cautiously, she rested her hand on my chest. Her cheek followed, her hair brushing against my jawline. My heartbeat kicked against my ribs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself stay there. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just breathed in the faint scent of her hair and let the silence wash over us, not empty this time, but full. Full of something unspoken, fragile, and maybe, finally, healing. It didn't happen all at once. We didn't suddenly fall back into each other's arms like nothing had happened. The truth is, love isn't healed by one conversation or a single touch. It's pieced back together in the small, patient moments, the ones that slowly remind you why you chose each other in the first place. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in her. She no longer kept her distance quite so carefully. If I was in the kitchen making coffee, she would wander in, her hand brushing against my back as she passed. If I sat reading on the couch, she'd curl up on the other end, her feet stretching out until they rested lightly against my leg. These weren't the grand gestures I once craved, but they were real. They were hers. And for my part, I found myself softening too. The anger that had hardened me began to loosen, replaced by something quieter, understanding. I realized she hadn't pushed me away out of lack of care, but out of fear. Fear of the age between us, fear of needing someone younger, fear of being vulnerable enough to let me close. I didn't excuse the hurt she had caused, but I began to see the woman beneath it, the one who was strong most of the time, but still human enough to falter. One night, we sat by the window, the city lights stretching out below us, soft and golden. She leaned against me, her head resting gently on my shoulder. The warmth of her hair brushed my cheek, and I closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle. For once, the silence wasn't a chasm between us, it was a bridge. Her hand found mine, fingers weaving together slowly, deliberately, as though she wanted to make sure I wouldn't pull away. I didn't. I squeezed lightly, grounding us both in that simple connection. After a while, she whispered, barely louder than the hum of the street below. "I don't want to lose you." The words caught me off guard, not because I doubted them, but because it was the first time she had said anything so vulnerable out loud. I turned slightly, just enough to see her face in the dim glow. Her eyes were tired, yes, but they were open, stripped of the walls and defenses she usually carried. "You won't," I said softly. And I meant it. We didn't fix everything that night. There were still cracks, still things unspoken, still the reality of who we were and the difference between our ages. But there, in that quiet room with her head against my shoulder and her fingers tangled with mine, it didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt like a beginning. Not the fiery, reckless beginning of a love story with no obstacles, but the steady, fragile kind, the kind that survives because it chooses to, again and again. And for the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't something to fear. It was something to share,